All right. Welcome to everybody on. It's just about 6 o'clock. I'll wait a minute or two more just to see if anyone else shows up. If not, no big deal. It will be recorded. So this will go out on my email list. I'll send it out on my YouTube channel. So different ways to see it too. So I have a lot to cover. If we have any interaction, we'll keep it minimal. If you have some, a dire question, just, feel free to raise your hand. But other than that, I want to just kind of get through it mostly. It'd be a lot of stuff, like I said, so probably somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes here is what I'm thinking, but we'll see what happens. And so I think I'm just going to get started here. And if I can just get a little feedback here, I'm talking, obviously, it looks like everything's working, but if someone wants to just say, all right, you can hear me, then we'll go right ahead.
I can hear you, Chris.
And I think there should be a little text box or something like that. Yeah, the chat, there it is. Okay. All right, cool. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. All right, so like I said, I'll get started. If anyone comes late, they can just jump on in. Otherwise, we can watch it later. So this is going to be a look at not just the upcoming year, but the upcoming decade, the 2020s. It's amazing to think that we're heading back to the 20s. You think about the roaring 20s, and that's now 100 years ago, which is kind of odd because it doesn't seem like it's all that long ago. But we have the 20s coming back. And the way I titled this, The Evolution of Liberty, you'll see what I mean by that. There's a lot of things, a lot of the outer planets anyway, that we'll cover. The transitions are making, like, for example, Pluto, the last time it was moving through the degrees that it is right now, well, we had a little thing called the American Revolution and what followed it. So that's why I wanted to call it Evolution of Liberty. So last time we had a move to a stage of liberty, and here we have another one, which might be more global in scope than the first one. But anyway, we'll get started here. I think I can. There we go. So, and so start with a little bit of humor. We all know on the left who that is. It's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Obviously, it's a cartoon. And she's, it's not her fault, but she's certainly been chosen to push certain end of the world agendas, things like that, which is nothing new at all. And that's why this right here on the right hand side is just one of many examples from the past. This is specific to climate change as the threat, but there have been many other threats, and many specific threats for climate change and what it will cause. And this one here from 1989, 30 years ago, talking about how entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. And we all know that didn't happen. In fact, the global temperatures have stabilized since 2000. Essentially, they've gone up and down like any normal fluctuation between interannual variability, but no trend since about 2000. There was a trend through the 80s into the 90s, certainly toward warming, but that followed a trend toward cooling that started in about the 50s through about 1980, and there was a warming trend before that. So there have been cyclical nature to the climate and whatnot. And scientifically speaking, there's absolutely no evidence that storms are increasing, etc. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but a little bit about me, and you'll see why this topic, for example, it's going to pop up again here later, why it's so dear to my heart. But my background, background in energy, sustainability, climate change specifically, and very left-brain upbringing on the East Coast, but have a very sensitive, intuitive side to myself. I'm a Pisces sun, Virgo moon, Virgo rising. So we got a little of the dichotomy there. And so I've been doing astrology for about 12 years at this point, professionally anyway. I've been doing it longer than that, but on a professional level, it's been about that. And I was actually born right there above that picture during a lunar eclipse in Virgo. So it was a lunar eclipse right at sunset moonrise. So a pretty intense aspect there. Here's my educational background, which is why this topic wanted to come out and why I see it when I look at these planets. My bachelor's was in meteorology back in New Hampshire. I have a master's in atmospheric science where I focused on greenhouse gases and climate change. Got another master's in environmental science and did the similar kind of thing, greenhouse gases, emissions and reductions and policies associated with it. So I am well versed in it, and I have witnessed since about 2000-ish, so 20 years now, where it has changed from something scientific to something political, more of a political weapon rather than a an actual science, weighing both sides and looking at things objectively. But as far as this talk is concerned, we're going to focus on the outer planets. So there's 5 right there that you see. You got Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. I'm not really going to look at the other planets because they're a little bit more fast moving, and these are the planets that really set the stage. And so we're going to look at the cycle. So the cycle starts at the conjunction. So for example, right here in January, I'm going to talk about this in just a minute, Saturn will be joining Pluto in Capricorn in the next couple of weeks. And it's peaking, I think, January 12th. That's the initiation of a cycle. So the conjunction starts it. It moves through, and so Saturn moves faster. Saturn's going to be squaring Pluto at some point, 90 degrees away, and that happens at a certain time, and then it'll be opposing Pluto, and then it'll be squaring it again on the other side, and then they'll come back again together. And that cycle happens to be about 37 years or so of a cycle. And all the cycles are different. So we have Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, Saturn, Neptune, etc. And so I'm going to cover what cycles come up as far as the hard degrees being the squares, oppositions, and the conjunctions. And we'll have a couple other ones in there I'll show you, but that'll be the primary focus. I'm also going to go over the sign changes. So these outer planets, not Jupiter and Saturn, because they change signs relatively often, but Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and even Chiron I'll bring in. And we're going to talk about all those planets changing signs here, especially in the middle of this decade coming up, right in the middle 2020s. You've got Uranus changing signs, Neptune changing signs, Pluto changing signs, and Chiron changing signs. So the first half of the decade has a slightly different energy than the second half. We'll talk about that. We also, I'm going to talk about some special topics like Regulus, which is currently in Virgo, just left Leo about 2011, 2012, depending on how you look at it. Chiron, like I just mentioned, we'll mention that. I'm going to look at this US Pluto return. So if you're not familiar, Pluto, takes about 250 years or something like that to go around the zodiac once. And so it's literally coming back to where it was at the same degrees that it was when the United States was formed. And so that's significant. And we want to address that because that's coming up. So whoever wins the US election in 2020, that person will be president during this US Pluto return in 2022, 2023. And so we'll get to that in a minute. Also, I've done a talk on the power generations, which you'll understand what that means when I show it to you, but I've brought some of those slides in here as well. And so that is going to be the overview of what we're looking at. So just to recap, I was just mentioning that whole idea that we start with the conjunction. So upper left, just as an example, this is the most recent Saturn-Neptune cycle. And in 1989, they were conjunct up there in Capricorn. Then we have our waxing square over to the right now, so top right, about just under 10 years later. Now Saturn moved faster than Neptune. It's 3 signs away. It was in Taurus. Neptune was in Aquarius. This was our waxing square. This is that growth of what was created during that conjunction. Then we have the culmination phase, which is the opposition. That happened around 2006, 2007, there in the bottom left, when Saturn reached Leo. Neptune was still in Aquarius, but now they have the opposition. Then the final waning square of that cycle here, for example, Saturn and Sag, Neptune and Pisces is 2015. 2016, I actually did a special talk about Saturn, Neptune, which I related to climate change And this particular cycle, I do see very much linked with the narrative of climate change from its start, its culmination, and kind of where it's going now. But the same thing is going to apply to the other planets. As far as what's going on in the 2020s, are they starting a cycle? Are they culminating a cycle? And what's interesting that we're going to see here in the early 2020s, especially the first year, next year, 2020, is the initiation of 3 cycles. And so that's pretty significant. But first, we're going to talk about on the broader picture. I mentioned Regulus. And so November 2011 is what I'm told is what I've seen as far as when Regulus switched from Leo to Virgo. And so Regulus is a fixed star. It's not a planet. And it takes about 2,000 years or so to change signs. So it's in a sign for a long time. And it entered Leo, you can see right there, just before what we consider the start of, the Judeo-Christian start of time there, year 0. So about 150 years before that, and it just ended a few years ago, less than 10 years ago. And so this kind of transition is not instant and immediate. There is a lag time. But essentially what Regulus deals with is power structures. And when we had Regulus in Leo, so I'm guessing everyone here is born between about the mid 1930s and 2011. If you're older than that or younger than that, hey, awesome. But the majority of people on the planet right now are born between the mid 30s and 2011, and that's when Regulus was at the 29th degree of Leo specifically. And so we're living in this energy of the 29th degree, which is critical. It's a critical energy. It feels urgent and necessary, and we can see what happened during that time from the development of nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, I should say, not necessarily energy when it's used properly, but the weaponry that can, mass destruction kind of weapons, and it's all very Leo, all very top-down, might is right, heavy masculine kind of force energy. And so this is the backdrop of power structures for the last 2,000 years up until recently. And, I say up until recently, people say, well, you look at it and say, well, nothing's changed. And it's true. And that's because we were all born with Regulus and Leo. So this energy is not going anywhere quickly. It's going to die out as gradually as the people that were born with it die out. And it's going to take another, 50 to 100 years for that to happen, essentially to fully move through. But there are phases where this gets pushed through. And that's what the 2020s are going to be a strong phase for that. So that's just what it looks like. There is Regulus, switching from Leo to Virgo. But this is a really good backdrop energy to understand. So here's our difference between Regulus and Leo, Regulus and Virgo. Really, it comes down to the way authority is delivered, essentially. And so you can see right down there, 29 degrees Leo. Anyone born between the mid 30s and 2011 is right there with it. We have 29 degrees. We have Regulus at 29 degrees Leo in our charts, pretty much across the board. Everyone on Earth and everyone on this webinar, I'm guessing. Anyway, I could be wrong. But anyway, Regulus and Leo, very imbalanced in terms of gender equality, strong hierarchy of authority and collectivism. So when I say collectivism, I'm talking about tyrannical, top-down government structures like fascism, like communism. They're both the same. They're two different ways of approaching the same result, which is total control of people and resources. And so that's something that was very, very, on the forefront for Regulus and Leo, whereas Regulus and Virgo is more decentralized authority. So it's where the pieces, Virgo is all about the pieces of the puzzle. And so like each individual sovereign unit dictating its own authority. And with advances in technology, which we'll get to, we have a better situation to create power structures based on that. But anyway, and then we look down here for like energy production. Centralization of power is huge with Regulus and Leo. If you're not familiar, there's like 3 grids that are in the United States. Just literally like a I think it's Texas has their own, but there's like an East grid, a West grid in Texas. Like that's how centralized power distribution is. And when you're looking at it from the pieces perspective, the Virgo perspective, we have things like microgrids and maybe free energy, which we'll mention again later as well. So ways to derive energy from a localized perspective. In Regulus and Leo, we have allopathic medicine, which is kind of breaking the body into little like machinery parts, essentially, whereas comprehensive medicine, holistic medicine, is more aligned with the Regulus in Virgo. Virgo being a very medical kind of energy, you know, associated with nurses and doctors and things like that. We also have what rose really prominently here with 29 degrees Leo, with Regulus at that 29 degrees Leo. So starting in the 1930s, what happened with sports, right? Entertainment, politics, right? I mean, it went from something subtle to something larger than life. So you have this giant disparity since about the mid 20th century, where once television came out, you had like JFK on television, and there was a whole new way to present yourself to the public. There was a whole new way you were a rock star, and there was rock and roll itself, and there is sports where you know, the salaries are far exceeding anything in the average range for the people actually watching the sports. And so you have this real disparity. You have the celebrity thing right now, where, you know, people are obsessed with celebrities, and there's a sense of being above the law and things like that. This is very Regulus in Leo. And Donald Trump is a great example of that. I mean, he was a celebrity before he even came into office. I want to talk specifically about him in here, and you'll understand the significance energetically of his chart and everything else. Whereas Regulus in Virgo, now we're talking about sovereign empowerment again. So the importance of every little piece, and not losing ourselves to inferiority complexes when it comes to what we perceive to be above us, whether it's leaders or sports figures or entertainment moguls and things like that. Also, when it comes to resources, you know, there's Virgo's the sign of management. So it's a more of a managing resources that we have versus extraction and devouring of resources, which is very Regulus in Leo. And then going down to, you know, how we govern ourselves. Regulus in Leo is very state first, individual last. Regulus in Virgo, we're going to focus on those pieces, those individuals. And so it's a very, it's an independent, sovereign kind of approach versus a codependent, you know, dependent of the state, which is what communism is and what fascism ultimately does too. They're both the same thing, like I said. And the reason why I have a cell phone down there on the bottom is because all of us were born with 29 degrees Leo. You got to think of it like a cell phone charging, right? So we're all charged up when we entered this space on that Leo energy, on the 29th degree of Leo energy. And so even though Regulus is now in Virgo, there's a lot of lingering structures and things in place on the planet and within us that are based on that original charging. So we're still powering up off of that Regulus and Leo energy, whether we want to or not, but that transition is happening very gradually, and it's going to continue to happen. And so what that means is a transformation of all systems. We won't go through all of it, but how our government runs. Right now, we have this, you know, super powerful federal government in Washington, something that the forefathers weren't even all into, the idea of having a strong central government. And we have all the representatives from every little, you know, section of every little county and state, all in this one easily manipulated and easily lobbied, you know, location in Washington, when they could be with modern technology in their local areas and Skyping and maybe quarterly meetings in one location like Washington, but all the work could get done locally from those local places they represent. And that would be a much harder system to corrupt with lobbyists and things like that. So that's an idea for how Regulus in Virgo can look when it comes to government, when it comes to education, having more choices, media, you know, having more of an objective and, you know, not paid for kind of media that's really gearing toward one political party or the other. When it comes to, again, everything else in this list, transportation, politics, marriage, global commerce, all of the things would change as that foundational energy changes. And so it just means, you know, goodbye to the hierarchy. You see up there in the upper left, that's that sort of Regulus and Leo pyramid hierarchy. And now we have this Regulus and Virgo circular nature to the symbiotic nature of life and everything else. It's more balanced in terms of gender, more balanced in terms of authority and self. It's also, you know, Regulus in Leo is very based on gurus and leaders. And again, those politicians that are rock stars in the entertainment industry and the sports figures. It's all about having a guru to look up to. And that's kind of a dynamic that is slowly going to be dying off. as we move further into Regulus in Virgo. And it's really a transition from separation consciousness, which is what the powers that be essentially want us to be in, so that they can create codependence, and more importantly, dependence on government, right? Dependence on the bigger system, the state. Whereas the Regulus in Virgo is the move toward connection consciousness. So if your consciousness is one of connection, then you don't feel separate. If your consciousness is one of separation, then you feel the need to attach and depend in order to feel safe. And so this is what I mean by sovereignty. And sovereignty is a big word for me. That's why the name of my brand essentially is Sovereign Harmony. That's the way I see the way toward harmony in the world is first with personal sovereignty, not necessarily national sovereignty, which is thrown out there quite a bit for like the right wing side, but personal sovereignty and how that looks. So here's Donald Trump's chart. We'll get back to him later, but I just wanted to preview it. If you're not familiar with his chart, and if that face just makes you cringe, I know a lot of people have that reaction to Trump sometimes, but stay neutral. That's my advice. But his rising sign, look at where it is, at 29 degrees Leo. That's where Regulus was when all of us were born. So he kind of represents this transition in a certain way. And that doesn't mean I'm looking at him saying, wow, he's a rock star, and he's going to be the person that has all these great intentions for positive change and everything. I mean, he literally, represents all that came before him. The way I look at him, he's the scapegoat for all the corruption that has always existed. And so there's more focus on it now with the media, because he obviously is some kind of potential threat to the big plan, whatever that big plan is on the global scale. I mean, he's probably not 100% a threat, but if he's perceived to be even a little bit of a threat, he's going to have to be the bad guy in everyone's eyes, and he's going to have to get out of office and everything. That's why you got what's going on with the impeachment right now and everything else. But we'll get back to his chart after we get through some stuff so you can understand what's going on. But it's really interesting. I'm going to move my clicker here. So his sun in Gemini, it progressed right up into his ascendant the summer of election 2016, which is really interesting. So his progressed sun crossed over from 29 degrees Leo to 0 degrees Virgo right before he took office, essentially. He'll get elected anyway. And so it's very symbolic energetically, if you think about it that way. So this is not a pro or anti-Trump thing. This is just objectively looking at the energy and who we have in our sphere at a time when it seems like it's pretty appropriate if you look at the transition here. Anyway, so the 2020s do start out with a bang. And what I mean by that is, like I said, all these cycles that are starting, we have 3 ending and starting here in 2020 itself. So in this first year of the decade, all 3 of these planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, are in Capricorn. And they're all going to be joining each other, essentially. And that's a very powerful energy, especially if we're talking about government, because that's, this is the energy of Capricorn, essentially, is government and collective organization and in all realms. And so very, very important time. What is set in motion here is going to have some precedent, some long-standing ripple effects for not only the rest of the decade, but for a few decades to come. And so I'm going to go over these cycles individually, one by one. I mean, obviously we want to take a collective view of it as well, but we'll go over them individually to start. So the very first cycle that we have that ends and begins is happening right here, like I mentioned earlier, Saturn conjunct Pluto. So the last time Saturn conjuncted Pluto was in the early 80s. So it's a 37-year cycle, and here we are in 2020 with it starting up again. So each cycle is different. So what happened in the last cycle isn't just going to repeat itself exactly, because there's different themes that go on. This last cycle, though, as you can see at this list right here, I'm going back to the last conjunction, the last waxing square, that first square, the opposition, the waning square, and now what we have coming up, which is this new conjunction, this new cycle. And so the last cycle started in Libra. We had a Saturn conjunction to Pluto in Libra, early 80s. And it's tough to figure out exactly what the main themes are, but what I picked up with this one, when I look at the time time lapse here over the course of the cycle is this seems to be very much associated with terrorism, and Libra being relations. So on a national level, that's national relations, right? And what was happening in the early 80s was a lot of uh, government funding of rebels when it comes to weapons and things like that. And what would become the terrorist networks that were behind things, or at least allegedly behind things like 9/11, or but at the very least 9/11 did happen, and there was responses in the realm of terrorism as a result of it. And and so we can interpret that whatever we want. But there was an initiation there in the early 80s. There was when this waxing square happened in the early 90s, 93, there actually was a bombing at the World Trade Center, if you don't remember that. So there was a big bomb that went off in like the basement of the World Trade Center. It did not collapse the building, obviously, because it was still around in 2001. But that was a pretty big deal at the time, and that was linked back to terrorist organizations that were probably funded at this time in the early 80s. Okay, and when we got to the opposition, the culmination, in other words, what's the results of everything that started at that time in the early 80s? Well, we have a period from the summer of 2001 to the summer of 2002. And we all know that 9/11 happened then, and all the responses to it as well, which are all the government grabs for power that were, the problem reaction solution. So we have a terrorism problem. Everybody's scared. What's our solution? You do things like the Patriot Act, and what is now how TSA is now at the airport versus what it was before this period. That changed drastically, and that was really, in one level, it's a push for more tyrannical control and power over people, etc. And so you can see how that played itself out. And ever since then, it's kind of been waning, and that cycle is coming to an end. What will the next Saturn Pluto cycle give us? It's really up in the air, but it's in Capricorn this time, and it's starting here right away. And we have, what's happening with the impeachment situation is probably going to line up. The timing is going to probably line up pretty good for what happens there. And the biggest thing to be worried about with Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn, if we're just being objective, is tyrannical pushes for power, whatever direction that is. And that this is like I said, this is that old Regulus in Leo collectivism, this codependence, big government kind of, dare I say, deep state kind of stuff. And that's what this energy can really be. So what initiates here in 2020 is going to be very important. And it's important for us, as individuals, to be aware of what we're allowing to be set in motion, because the momentum is going to be very, very strong. So moving on to the next one. So from about April to November of 2020, coming up, we have a new cycle between Jupiter and Pluto. So we have the Saturn, Pluto, now we have Jupiter and Pluto. And this is a shorter cycle. It's only about 13 years. So the last one started in 2007. You can see that right there. So in December of 2007, we had a conjunction in Sagittarius. And for me, if I look back at this, I feel like this had a lot to do with the jump in connectivity technology, really strong at that time. The first smartphones came out. So December 2007 was when some of the first people were getting smartphones for Christmas and things like that. And so this ability to be connected at all times in our pocket really blew up there. And you have Jupiter, Pluto, that's in a rapid expansion kind of energy. And it happened in Sag. And there's an energy that has to do with connectivity itself, information exchange and things like that. So it really it kind of brought long distances closer together on an instant. Now you have like FaceTime on a phone and things like that. I mean, this is unbelievable. You could be on the other side of the planet and speak on real time to someone anywhere. And that's pretty rapid advancement. And that's the nature of Jupiter, Pluto. And so this cycle is going to be coming to an end, like I said. So it'll wrap itself up through most of 2020. So it's going to take a little while because Jupiter is going to retrograde, and they'll be connected by the 1 degree orb anywhere between April and November, which what happens in November 2020? We have an election coming up. So in the US, this is going to be pretty important as far as what comes of this and what starts from it. So we have, Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter, Pluto, and we also have what will be Jupiter, Saturn, all happening this year coming up. Yeah, I think most of the other cycles that I'll go over, I'll probably go over a little more briefly because these are the big boys. These are the bad, the ones that are going to have a long-standing energetic resonance or lifetime to them. The Jupiter Saturn cycle is a 20-year cycle, and the last one initiated in May of 2000. Okay, but they'll be coming back together again right around the solstice this year coming up. So about a year from now, they'll be joining each other. In fact, they'll join each other, and while they are in this 1-degree orb, they're both going to transition from Capricorn to Aquarius, which is like a precursor, in my opinion, to what we'll talk about a little bit later, which is Pluto exiting Capricorn for Aquarius, because Pluto has been in Capricorn since 2008, and it will be leaving about 2024, 2025. And so this feels like, the Saturn Jupiter conjunction that transitions both signs. It's like this crossover that's precursoring Pluto's move to Aquarius in a few years. Okay, and what happened with this cycle, Jupiter Saturn? If you look back at it, this is just a graph on the right of the Nasdaq. There was what was called the dot-com bubble that pretty much bursts right there in the early summer of 2000. And we got Jupiter Saturn. This is, we got to have realistic limitations. That's kind of the energy of that when that happens. And then we had the waxing square, which is associated in 0506 with the essentially the real estate market peaking and heading downward after that. So there was a pretty tough hit a lot of people took then. And we can look at the other time periods for when it peaked and whatnot. But the idea being that this cycle had seems to be tied to certain economic significant economic transitions that happened over the last 20 years or so. And like I said, we have this one coming up. So when we leave 2020, we're leaving it with 3 cycles: one a 37-year cycle, another a 13-year cycle, and the last one a 20-year cycle. So we're talking about a couple to a few decades, like 2 to 3 decades of ripple effects from what initiates in 2020. And that's pretty significant. You don't get that often. In fact, I think I saw somewhere Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto have not been in Capricorn together, all 3, or I guess this is only the 3rd time, I think, in 2,000 years or something like that. It's really pretty rare. And this is heavy duty stuff, very much related to tyranny, government level control, and things like that. So important to be vigilant in times like this, because what gets presented as good and good for all isn't always. And that's how they get us, essentially. Not to be paranoid or anything, but that's, this is the kind of time period where things can really take off in their own direction without our conscious intent. So that takes us out of 2020, and we're going to just move right through. And like some of these cycles are a little bit more minor. What I'm looking at here, this is a Jupiter Uranus cycle, and this is about a 13-year cycle as well. And what we have is we haven't quite finished the last cycle. The last cycle started in 2010, 2011, when Uranus and Jupiter were conjunct. And where we're coming up to here in January 2021, so about 13 months from now, we have the waning square of that interaction. And to me, whenever I see Jupiter and Uranus, I think of technology. And I was a little stumped at this time period as far as what significantly came out. I'm sure there's something that would be a eureka moment, like, aha, that's it. That's what this cycle represents. But there's a lot of technologies that have been developed that haven't been implemented. And, this all goes back to the powers that be, et cetera, that allow or disallow certain technologies being used. And so the next conjunction, which we'll talk about in a minute when we get to it, will be in April of 2024, but we're still finishing up the previous cycle. So this one, we're coming into this new decade still on the previous Jupiter-Uranus cycle. Then we have a more significant and longer lasting cycle here, the Saturn Uranus cycle. And this one we are actually still, we're still moving through that one as well. So the Jupiter Uranus, we're going to the waning square soon next year. This one will come up right after that. So January 2021, Jupiter Uranus starts a cycle, or gets the waning square of its previous cycle. And then we get to 21, 22, and we have the waning square for this one. And to me, this one has a lot to do with where science meets policy. Science being represented by Uranus, policy, Saturn, and this one, as well as the Saturn-Neptune cycles that we are currently in, that are finishing up, and that will, the Saturn-Neptune one will start again in the mid decade, whereas this one won't start again until next decade, 2030s. But they're linked. And so going back to the climate change thing, the science and the politics of all of that, like I said, I've witnessed a transition from science to politics over the last 20 years. And when I see this, 1988, I mean, when it comes to, and in Sag too, the conjunction here between these two planets, when it comes to mixing science and policy, if you're not familiar, James Hansen, who worked for NOAA, I think he still does actually, but he presented essentially to Congress, I think, in the summer of 1988, which happened to be a very hot, very dry summer across the entire US, which happens and happened more frequently about 80 to 100 years ago than it does now. But that particular summer was very hot, very dry, and it was what it was. And so this one here is when he presented the information about CO2 and emissions and the need to curb them, or else we're all going to burn up. And of course, it's convenient when it's burning up outside when you're talking about that. So this is, I kind of see that as the initiation of it. When the waxing square happens here in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was in college at that time as an undergrad, learning about climate science, not just CO2 science, but climate science, you know, sun cycles and things like that that affect climate. And this is when the manipulation of science really started. This is when, if you're not familiar, the Michael Mann hockey stick graph came out. And that was a blatant slap in the face to the science of, you know, climate science, because it did not follow the reality essentially that was well known among scientists. Even the 1990 IPCC report showed a medieval warm period in the, you know, about 1200 plus or minus a couple hundred years, and a little ice age about, say, 1700 plus or minus a couple hundred years. And so there's some natural cycles shown in that. But the Michael Mann graph essentially erased the variability in the climate before humans started emitting CO2 and made it look like the emissions of CO2 made the planet warm beyond what it normally should be, even though there's no evidence that that actually happened based on actual data. But anyway, when the opposition happened, that is in the 2008, 2010, this is when the actual finding for CO2 was considered to be endangerment. So there was an official endangerment finding, I think, through the EPA, I believe. And so that made it okay to regulate CO2 emissions because of that finding. And so you can see that mixture of science and policy there. And that's the culmination of what started back in 1988, like 20 years before that, with that James Hansen meeting. And now we are entering our waning square, 21 and 22. So 2021 and 2022, when I get to a couple of things ahead, a few slides ahead, I'll remind you of this time period for the waning square, because there's something, there's an IPCC report coming out in 2022, essentially. That's the next one. And this one is actually going to include solar particle forcing as a consideration, you know, and from my research and what I you know, have been finding information-wise, it's very hard to come to the conclusion scientifically that humans are at fault when you factor in solar particle forcing. You'd think, well, see, IPCC, shouldn't they have been including every factor all the time? And it's not true. I mean, that's a governmental organization with a political motive, and they've only focused on CO2 and essentially ignore the idea of there being any other cause. for climate change for any other reason. But this 2022 IPC report is going to include some more natural factors, and it might be, part of what winds this cycle down, essentially. We're going to talk about that when we get to Saturn, Neptune, because that's where it's even more prominent, I think. So we'll move that one on. So here's Jupiter, Neptune. So Saturn, Neptune will come later. But when we get to the spring of 2022, we'll have a brand new cycle of Jupiter and Neptune. So that's a 13-year cycle, roughly. It takes 12 years for Jupiter to go around the zodiac, and Neptune moves pretty slow. So in general, it's about 13 years before it catches up again, because Neptune does move a little bit, but it catches up pretty quickly. Anyway, so the last Jupiter-Neptune cycle started in 2009. And I got that little road over there with the word hope on it. And this is when we had the inauguration of Barack Obama. It was this great new phase coming in, right? And this is an Aquarius, so it's like the idea of the future, this sort of unrealistic, idealistic view of the future that was, you could feel it in the air back in 2009. And I kind of bought into it on a certain level too. It just seemed like, oh, the Bush era is over, and that what a horrible, like, warring era that was. And now we have this peace bringer, Barack Obama, and it's going to be wonderful. Life's going to be wonderful from here on out. And that was a general nature of the atmosphere in the U.S. People that were staunchly right-winged and whatnot obviously didn't agree, but you kind of got the sense that there was some change that happened, and we got some positive things to look forward to. And so that was the energy we were starting with then. And the rest of this cycle kind of almost really just takes us through his presidency, and then we just had the waning square here in Sag Pisces. The whole year of 2019 up until recently, until about September, October, we were dealing with the Jupiter Neptune square, which was very, very prominent and strong, and I've been talking about it all year on my videos, being an energy of zealotry and disclosure, and it has been a year like that. And so, we start with this conjunction in 2009, all this hope for the future, and then it turns to like this doom for the future, right? In 2019, this was most predicated by the whole Greta Thunberg journey and the whole climate activist movement that happened. And we went from 2009, everything's going to be great, to the waning square here in 2019, where we're all going to die. And it really was quite an interesting twist. And this is very Jupiter Neptune, because everything's blown out of proportion, right? The positivity is blown out of proportion in 2009, and this negativity is blown out of proportion in 2019. And that's the nature of Jupiter Neptune. You'd expect that. But that wasn't the only thing going on. There was also the Epstein situation, and many people not believing the narrative there. There was a study for Building 7 and on 9/11, and it basically showed that there's no way it could have fell due to office fires, which was the official story. And that's the one building that didn't get hit by an airplane, but also collapsed in the same way that the other two did. So very suspicious on the surface. And then the studies coming out and saying, yeah, it didn't fall the way we were told. And if it did, it would be the first and only. It's the only one. It would be the first one ever, and then the only one since, as far as a high-rise steel frame building that fell due to office fires. It's never happened before or after. So that would be pretty unprecedented, considering it happened just hours after two other buildings down the street fell the same way. There's a reason for suspicion. And this is one of those things that people, again, it brings up this idea of questioning narratives and things. And that's with all the zealotry in the air, both sides of the coin, lots of zealotry, but also opportunities for that kind of disclosure as well. And so this next conjunction will come, here in a couple of years, April 2022. Who knows what that will be about? It's going to be in Pisces, so the potential for it to be another kind of dreamy, hopeful period is pretty high. But then again, the other side of that is, again, it's probably be something like, half the people think the future is bright, the other half think it's doom. It'll be the same kind of extremes. Anyway, so that'll take us to what will be happening throughout 2022 and 2023, which is what I mentioned previously, the USA Pluto Return. So Pluto right down there. You can see this encircled right down here. 27 degrees or so Capricorn is where Pluto was when the declaration was signed. And, you know, there's contention as far as what the official time and of the signing was, etc. But this is what's called a Sibley chart. I use it. I think it's pretty handy. I mean, one of the things is going back to 9/11. Pluto was essentially hovering over the ascendant of the U.S., which is obviously the only time it's been there during the entire tenure of the USA, and that's when 9/11 happened. So you know, this chart seems to line up for me as far as being an accurate chart. But either way, the Pluto return is going to be, no matter which hour you pick on that day, it's going to be pretty much the same. So Pluto return wise, it's definitely happening. It's going to be hovering over 27 degrees back and forth between 2022 and 2023. And so what can we expect with that? I think there's lots of question marks, but you know, it's definitely an energy of, you know, completion, and what the U.S. stands for, what it stood for when it first was enacted, and everything else. And it's really a make or break point, I think, in a lot of ways. So we can either transform, you know, be done with one cycle and completely transform, or we can cling to whatever, you know, old ways there are, and eventually erode and fall apart. This could be, and I'll mention this maybe a little bit later too, when it comes to the dollar, for example, which U.S. dollar has been #1 in the world for a while, and there's indications that it could be challenged by other means of currency and whatnot. And so this could be the end of that road of the dollar or the petrodollar being on top. Who knows? It's all speculative, but this is significant. It's a significant energy nonetheless, and it will be happening here 2 or 3 years from now, regardless. Okay. And so we'll just move on from that one, but that's just something to play with, something to see that's on the horizon here. This is very significant. Most nations don't reach a Pluto return. You know, we talk about Saturn returns for humans. Those are about every 30 years or so, 29 years. And so you can get 2 or 3 in a lifetime, but most nations don't see 2 or 3 Pluto returns in a lifetime. You know, lucky to get one. And so I think it was an interesting quote by somebody way back, like 2,000 years ago. Like, this is back in like the Greek and Roman kind of times, and I forget who it was. And he said that even the greatest democracy can't last more than 250 years or something like that, which is roughly the cycle of Pluto. You know, whether he's right or wrong is up for debate, obviously, but you know, there might be reasons energetically for that. We'll see. Hopefully not, but we will see. And so, speaking of Pluto being in late Capricorn at that time, right after that, about a year later, so in the end of 2023 through 2024, Pluto's going to enter Aquarius, a place it has not been in a while. So it's been in Capricorn, like we said, since 2008. This last transit of Aquarius was 1778 to 1794. And Aquarius being in energy, you know, this is kind of very representative of the United States itself. We have the moon in Aquarius in the US chart, if you saw that, if you caught that. There was several Aquarian folks, like, I think like, I forget who was Aquarius. Actually, I can't remember right now. But there was like a few of the founding fathers were Aquarians, and the whole principle of freedom and liberty and everything is very Aquarian, very, you know, sovereignty and self, you know, self-driven, etc. And so it's very anti-big government. It's very sovereign-based versus state-based. And so that's you know, very, very common with the Aquarian energy. When you look at the last trip of Pluto through Aquarius, it was the Pluto and Capricorn years, which were about 1762 up until 1778. And that's when all the taxation and all that was happening from the British. And then at the very end of that was the actual signing of the Declaration of Independence. But most of that war, most of that actual American Revolution happened when Pluto was in Aquarius. So it was sort of the fight for freedom at that point. And before it was, you know, tyranny that we were rebelling against, then it became that fight for freedom. And so we have the same theme coming up here in a few years. We have Pluto re-entering Aquarius. It's going to pass where Pluto was when the U.S. was signed into being, and we'll be in that same energy of what the American Revolution was. And so going outside the U.S. now, You know, you could think of other situations like what's going on in Hong Kong right now. You know, we have this basically rebellion against communism, rebellion against tyranny. And that's what we just talked about before with all that Capricorn energy. This is a tyranny, Pluto and Capricorn. And so this buildup, and could Hong Kong be heading to their own revolution? Why not, right? Maybe the people rebel against the communist government in China. It's possible, right? I mean, it would be a different kind of fight, obviously, in the modern era, and the fact that they live where they'd be fighting instead of the U.S., which had that, you know, the home field advantage situation going on, where, you know, the British had to send ships overseas, and you know, if they did supplies, it would take a long time to get them, and that stuff doesn't exist anymore. So who knows what this means? But we got to start looking at the potential on a global level of these same kinds of revolutions, these same kinds of, again, liberty demands. And this is what I mean by the title of this, you know, evolution of liberty. I mentioned Jupiter and Saturn crossing each other over into Aquarius prior to this. So they do that here at the end of 2020, and literally 3 years later, Pluto follows in its footsteps. So there is this transition into this kind of fight for freedom energy that is going to be happening over the next couple of years. And then on the heels of that will be Jupiter and Pluto, which again, that cycle, we already talked about it, it starts here November to April. That's that first list right there, or I'm sorry, April to November of 2020. So this is the new cycle. So we can't really tell or predict what's going to happen with the waxing square until we know what happens with the conjunction. But it's just a timeline. And we'll see that this Jupiter-Pluto goes through, you know, 4 major aspects all within this decade. So we're going to, you know, whip through the other ones here, but we won't linger on this too long. But, you know, what does come of this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction here in 2020? Because that's going to tell us what's going to ripple outward from there. So we'll skip that one for now. Jupiter conjunct Uranus, we talked about finishing up the previous Jupiter-Uranus cycle, okay? And that was the one that started in 2010. And now, again, finishes up in January 2021, which I already talked about. And the new one will start in April of 2024 in Taurus. It's a conjunction in Taurus. You know, could this be technological advances in terms of food and water and the basic needs of things? You know, that seems like a pretty solid guess as far as what's coming. I mean, there's already technologies out there where you can evaporate water from the air essentially to get fresh water, or you can use like solar energy to evaporate, you know, ocean water to get fresh water as well. And then when it comes to food production, et cetera, I mean, interesting to note that higher CO2 levels when it comes to photosynthesis, the more CO2 a plant has, plant food in other words, the less water it needs. So there's actually there's been a drought resistance benefit to higher CO2 levels. Not that they're that high, because they've been much higher in the past, but relatively speaking, they're higher than they were 100 years ago. And that even that has contributed to some greening of the earth and some you know, positive things for plant growth and things like that, and crop growth. That's not something you hear though, because again, big government wants to regulate that, and they want to have more control, more tyranny. Something that we definitely have to watch out for here coming up. And so here is the Jupiter-Saturn, which again, they're the ones that cross each other over the threshold from Capricorn to Aquarius next year on the solstice. And here they are in 2024, 2025, coming up on their waxing square. So again, hard to make predictions based on, you know, until we know what happens during the conjunction, which won't be for about a year from now. But this will be taking that to the next level, essentially, or challenging that at that time. And you can see right here that they're going to actually reach their opposition right at the end of this decade, essentially, like beginning of the next decade, essentially. I think actually that's an error. I think that should be 2029, November, not 2030. So I believe that's true. Anyway, but Jupiter, Saturn, again, it's got that sense of limits to growth, because you got like this, you know, this planet wants to grow, but it can only grow within the limits of its pot, and that's Saturn, right? And that's kind of the energy of this. And the previous one, like we said, had a lot to do with like this, like the NASDAQ.com bubble and the real estate market, and And so what is this going to bring? We don't know. We just can't tell right now, but that's when it's going to be happening. And then we have the Jupiter Neptune cycle that I talked about, which is 2021, coming up on its waxing square. So, oh, sorry, it's 2022. That's when it was. So they're going to conjunct in Pisces. Again, that's going to be that real airy kind of, hope for the future, unrealistic hopes and things like that, combined with unrealistic despair. Okay, the Pisces way, right? And how is that going to wax itself into being in the mid part of the decade, and then as we leave the decade, okay? Then we have another sign change. We talked about Pluto changing signs. Now we're coming up to Neptune, which 2025, 2026, this is something, Neptune's about 15 years per sign. So it's been in Pisces since 2011, and its last transit in Aries was in the 1860s, early 1870s. And what's interesting here is because I just talked about the sign change for Pluto and how that transition was pretty much the American Revolution. And now we have a transition which is pretty much the Civil War, right? As far as the energy going on. Not that I'm predicting war happening in the middle part of the 2020s, but it would be consistent, cyclically speaking, okay? Because we have a couple of the most, the two most infamous historical wars in the U.S. And they happened when Pluto went from Capricorn to Aquarius, and when Neptune went from Pisces to Aries. And so that's something to think about, something to look out there for, and assess. Aries is a sign of war. It's ruled by Mars, and Neptune is about deception and underhanded deals, and that's when you're fighting for what you don't even know what you're fighting for. And that was very the Civil War, depending on how you look at it historically, there were other reasons than slavery for the Civil War. There were, lots of things going on there. And so that's that Neptune aspect where we're made to believe that it's just one singular focus, when there was other stuff going on. And so we don't know how this kind of manipulation can happen here coming up, but we will see. And what's interesting to note here with Neptune, when it enters Aries, in June 2025, it will be entering Aries with Saturn. So they'll be initiating, which we're going to talk about this cycle next, the Saturn-Neptune cycle. But that cycle initiates literally as those two planets are crossing the threshold from Pisces to Aries. And while both of those planets are forming an exact square to Jupiter, which is crossing from Gemini to Cancer at that time. And so this is cycles within cycles here, because we have the initiation of Saturn and Neptune happening at the exact same time that Jupiter is squaring Saturn. So that's the waxing square from that cycle, and squaring Neptune, the waxing square from that cycle. So we have three different cycles happening there. So 2025 becomes similar to 2020 in that major cycles are activated. So that becomes a significant time. So the mid-2020s is very interesting because we have all this transition happening. Whereas, beginning of the 2020s, we have most of that focused in Capricorn, those cycles starting. We have a lot of sign changes happening in the middle part, and a lot of things happening with that. So here is that Saturn Neptune. So we just talked about it, crossing from Pisces into Aries at that time on June 2025. But their conjunction will linger for about a year almost. And this is that 37-year cycle. Again, the last one we had started in 1989. Okay, so remember when I talked about Saturn Uranus, that cycle, and how that had to do with like science and policy, and starting in 1988 with James Hansen going to Congress and testifying, and then culminating with finding carbon dioxide as an endangerment chemical, etc. Well, in conjunction with this Saturn Neptune cycle, which I phrase as the structured story, Neptune is very much about the story, and Saturn is the structure to it. And in 1989, so James Hansen did do that Congress, situation in 1988, but it wasn't really announced to the public until literally the night before the Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989. This is really interesting because you can look it up yourself. I kind of had to do a double take and make sure the dates were correct when I looked at it. And Margaret Thatcher actually made a pretty big worldwide kind of speech about climate change, the first of its kind. that really could like made it so it sound like we have this imminent threat that we have to unite, in other words, form one world government to deal with. And the reason, I mean, you can think about it. I mean, in my opinion, what the reason for that timing, they knew the Berlin Wall was coming down, and that Berlin Wall was very symbolic. It represented the biggest threat to humanity, right? The Cold War, the mutually assured destruction of nuclear weapons, etc. With the Berlin Wall falling, it really was the beginning of the end of Western communism, I guess we could say, because obviously China's still going strong, but it really was the beginning and end of that, you know. And so the new story was we have a global cataclysm on the way. And 1989, if you were paying attention to that, my first slide I showed you was that San Jose Mercury news article from 1989, talking about we only have 10 years left. And if we don't curb climate change by 2000, there's going to be cities underwater and everything else that we still hear now about 10 years from now, 2030, right? And that's why, so it's interesting to note, like, you talk to some people, they think the 2020s is the decade that everything falls apart and the world goes to dust. But what we're looking at here is there's a lot more life left here. And I think it's going to be the narratives that go to dust, essentially, and there'll be new narratives developed. Of course, I mean, if your primary intention is to control the world's resources and people, if climate change doesn't work anymore, you'll find something else, just like the Cold War didn't work anymore. And so they found something else, and that was climate change. And then here we are in the late 90s, same exact time that the Saturn Uranus waxing square happened. Very interesting. And that's we have the Michael Mann graph, like I said. What's interesting here, the opposition, the culmination, this is exactly when Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out. So you can think of it as the culmination of the story, right? Because now it's more mainstream. People are watching it everywhere. If you didn't catch Margaret Thatcher's speech, well, you probably saw Inconvenient Truth. And the Arctic sea ice is going to be gone by 2013 potentially, which didn't happen and doesn't look like it's going to happen. But these are the kind of parts of that structured story that we heard about back then. And then we have 2015, 2016. I actually did, like I said, I did a talk at SDAS, San Diego Astrological Society, back in June of 2016, talking about this right here, the waning square of Saturn and Neptune, which is the waning down from that cycle. And I did a lot more in depth, and I'll probably put a link to that when I post this to YouTube. I'll put a link to that below it, so you can look at that entire presentation. That was a live presentation, but I did record the audio, and I put slides to it, so it's actually totally watchable, similar to this, essentially. But that goes more in depth with the manipulation of the weather and that kind of technology and how that's messing up data in the first place and everything else. But this cycle comes to an end then in 2025, 2026. And like I said, they conjunct each other as they move from Pisces into Aries in this case. And what will the next structured story be? And I mentioned something about the IPCC report in 2022, including some more natural forcing factors in its report than it has before. But there's also a new satellite technology that's going to be going up in 2026. Okay, and I got a slide here that I'll show you that briefly later. But this new satellite technology essentially can more accurately depict the contribution of the gases in the atmosphere to absorption of infrared radiation, which is just another way of saying what's leading or not leading to warming or cooling in the atmosphere. More specifically, we have a little bit less technological capabilities for that right now, but this new satellite launch will pretty much I think, in my opinion, put everything to bed, because it's going to be very clear that there's no link between CO2 and any kind of warming in the atmosphere. And this is that slide I was talking about. So, what's coming for climate science, we have the solar particle forcing included in IPCC in 2022. And that's also when Jupiter will be conjunct Neptune, right? And, perhaps part of that energy is, we're all going to be okay after all. Or they're going to double down and say, well, even though this particle forcing is significant, we still have to stop CO2, and we're still all going to die if we don't, and that kind of thing. That could be, it's probably be both, and most likely within this forum. That's what it's called. a climate modeling satellite. Like I say, what it does, it helps measure more accurately the spectrum of where the gases are absorbing radiation. And if I put this one up, you can understand. So this is an interesting little graph, and just follow my cursor here. But this is something this satellite will show more clearly. This is what we have now, but the satellite will be able to depict this even more. So you can see CO2. If it wasn't for CO2 in the atmosphere, this would be the profile, this green line. That's why I did CO2 0, green, which is just saying, this dip is saying that in this frequency range, this is where CO2 absorbs heat. And it does. That's not up for debate. It's a greenhouse gas. It is what it is. Only in that band. It's weak everywhere else. Okay. But this next technology will actually help us determine if we can find a CO2 signature anywhere else. Okay. But what it's most likely to find, in my opinion, is that there will be no significant difference. And as you can see here, there's a line, and it's black going all the way through. That's 400 ppm. That's where we're at right now. We're a little higher than that as far as concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. But if we just theoretically double that, how does that change the spectrum? And you can see the red line and the black line are pretty much the same, which means that doubling CO2 or having it, even it, I mean, it'd be nice to see a 200 ppm here just for fun. It makes no significant difference to how CO2 absorbs heat, because CO2 is essentially saturated in the atmosphere. It's already doing everything it's going to do. And so like a significant 100 ppm reduction, if we went through the cost of doing that, and at the cost of everybody's money and lives and everything else, and what that would cause to get it down to 300, let's say, that would be very hard to do, almost impossible. It wouldn't do anything. Similarly, if we let it go another 100 higher, it wouldn't do anything. And that's what this science is saying. And and that's exactly what this satellite is likely to do. And so that's why I see that cycle very linked to that structured story. Another sign change is Uranus entering a Gemini. And this is 2025, 2026. It's only about 7 years per sign, so this is not as long lasting as the other outer planets. And it's been in Taurus since 2018, just last year. So it's got some time left in Taurus here for 7 more years. And then it enters Gemini. And it's interesting to note that the last time that Uranus transited Gemini was World War II, in the post-World War II era, including the atom bomb, etc. So again, we have almost all the significant wars represented in the US, and US wars represented here with the sign changes that happened in the mid-decade. I don't want to make any predictions, but also at Uranus and Gemini, though, we do have rapid technological advancement, the atom bomb being a great example of that, right? I mean, that advanced rapidly. It went from like literally, I think Truman didn't even hear about it until like April of 1945. Then 4 months later, he was dropping it. So it was such a rapid advancement in deployment. That's a negative thing, but this can also be very positively aligned with like rapid technological advancements. And really that's what's going to create more sovereignty, more freedom, more ability to avoid tyrannical systems of government, etc. And then we also have Chiron around that same time, about a year later, entering Taurus. It's been in Aries since 2018, since last year. So similar to Uranus, it's on about the same pace right now. So it's got a few years left, then it goes to Taurus. Last transit of Taurus is late 70s, early 80s, basically. This is like a Taurus generation. This is, I'm gonna show you a couple slides later real quick about the power generations that I mentioned earlier. But people born in that range, which includes myself, we're kind of raised for a world that didn't exist by the time we got there. There was no technology when we were kids, and suddenly it was in our faces when we were young adults. And so it's just a different generational kind of feel to it. So we have a few other cycles. I'm just going to whip through these because, again, these are speculative. Jupiter opposite Pluto is just going back to, what's going to start here in 2020, what waxes in 2023. So we don't know what's going to culminate if we don't know what's started yet. So, but that's just to show you where that is. And then we have a quick one I want to go over. Uranus and Gemini trining Pluto and Aquarius here in 2026 to 2028, so the later part of the decade. It's only interesting to me because of the recent square between these. So that's a cycle that started in the late 1960s, Pluto-Uranus, and it's not going to culminate, or the opposition doesn't happen until the mid 2040s. And so the square between them in 2012 to 2015 was pretty significant. And this has a lot to do with societal change on a larger level. And when we have this Uranus Gemini, which could be that rapid deployment of technology combined with this Pluto and Aquarius, this sort of fighting for freedom, could this be a gradual, easy development of technologies like free energy, for example, which we'll talk about in a second. And then we got, more of these cycles that we can't address, like Jupiter Uranus, starts in 2024. Too far out to say what's going to start then, but this could be part of the rapidly deploying technologies as well. And then we have the Saturn waxing square Pluto. So this is the Saturn-Pluto square that starts here in January. So this is, the one that starts right on our doorstep here in a few weeks. That will be going through its waxing phase at the end of the decade. So starts at the very beginning, end of the decade, we're going to wax. So what is implemented here is going to go through its challenge phase, or its, further implementation phase. And what does that mean? Like I said, we got to watch out for the tyranny, watch out for the big government kind of forceful nature of things, because that's the energy of that. Then we have Jupiter opposite Neptune again. Don't know where that's gonna go unless we know where it starts. And then we got Jupiter waning square to Pluto. Similar thing. It starts here in 2020, so it's just gonna be finishing up. So the end of the decade is more of the cycles that have started at the beginning of the decade, just moving through their phases, but nothing necessarily new starting after the mid part of the decade. Then we have to finish it off, we have the Jupiter opposite Saturn. So that takes us back. I think I want to just rehash Regulus. So again, Regulus switching about 2011 or so from Leo to Virgo. This changes power structures on many levels. And, there it is again. And then go back to Trump's chart. So like I said, we've got the ascendant right there at 29 degrees Leo, where all of us had our Regulus when we were born. And we got the movement of that progressed sun down to the ascendant, where it crossed the ascendant just a couple of months before he was elected. So this is a significant energy. His energy is a significant energy for this transition. It doesn't mean positive, negative. You can hate him, love him, doesn't matter. It's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the energy transition and what his role is. And like I said before, in my opinion, his role is, part of this crumbling of the hierarchies of Regulus and Leo, and in the structures and everything else. He represents everything that came before him. So he's not exempt from any of the corruption that's being exposed while he is in office, but his presence itself is allowing for exposure of corruption, period. Whether it's his own or that of others. It's this, and this is something we haven't seen ever. Presidents are usually polished and censored and everything else. And here's someone who's uncensored. And so it's a challenge for the deep state, quote unquote, to keep their plans on wraps, even if he's part of the plans, because he's such a wild card. And so, like I said, it had nothing to do with liking him, hating him. It has to do with the idea that this is the energy present for a reason. And whether or not this energy sticks around for another 4 years is up for debate. Very interesting when you look at the 2020 election. Mercury will be stationary direct on November 3rd, election day. And Mars will be still in retrograde, but somewhat stationary and about to move direct. So in other words, we'll be in the middle of a Mercury and Mars retrograde, essentially coming up to the ends of those retrogrades. Very precarious energy. Not going to make any predictions, but that's what we're looking at. And just talking about elections and whatnot, what made Trump so popular on the right in 2016, and Bernie Sanders, he was the other popular one. I mean, it was the working of, the corrupt, deeper motives on a higher level that put Hillary into position and knocked Bernie Sanders out. Because if you look at popularity base, Bernie was popular and Trump was popular. Those are two popular candidates in 2016. Hillary was the candidate you're supposed to vote for, but Bernie Sanders was the one people wanted to. And they had to, do some corruption over there to DNC to make sure that he wasn't it and that Hillary was. But what made him popular is the same reason that made Trump popular. It's just a difference in opinion politically. And what was similar about them was that from that person's perspective, the voter perspective, They were voting for someone who was more authentic, more down to earth, less of a politician and more of an authentic human. And so from the left perspective, Bernie Sanders seems like the authentic grandfather type. Santa Claus is going to give you presents, you know. And for the right wing, it was Trump. He was, you know, not, at least he advertised himself as not part of the deep state and, you know, someone different. He's a businessman, not a politician. And so this idea of not being the typical politician was popular. It was, regardless of your political views, that was popular 100, you know, across the board. And the reason for that is the shifting we're going in. I mean, 2016 is the first, you know, one of the first elections post Regulus and Virgo, right? Regulus entered Virgo at the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, but really didn't kick in. And so you have this sort of awakening happening where people are sick of being controlled and ruled by an elite class. And the whole idea of America, which we're getting back again, Pluto and Aquarius coming up, here it comes, the evolution of liberty. And so the idea of voting for someone who at least appears to you, whatever your perceptions are, as authentic, as an authentic human and not a politician, it's going to only increase here as we move. Like, look at the popularity of Tulsi Gabbard right now amongst people, not amongst the DNC, of course, but amongst the people is like, whoa, she's a real person. She's anti-war, and she's, you know, and yeah, and she seems legit, but yet she's being blocked, you know. And so that's what this energy is. People are waking up and they want real people. They don't want politicians. They don't want an elite ruling class anymore. Okay. And you know what's happening in Hong Kong right now is also a representation of that. And so, you know, the shift in 2012, we talked about Pluto Uranus, that square that happened 2012 to 2015. It was very, very strong, very important. But we also had, between 2004 and 2012, was this Venus occultation, which is like an eclipse. So when Venus crosses the solar disk, essentially. And when it does that, it happens in pairs that are 8 years apart. So we had one 1874 to 1882. And then we just had our most recent one, 2004 to 2012, and it won't be until early next century that we get the next one. But what these windows tend to be, these 8-year windows of Venus, and it's always in Gemini. These 8-year windows when Venus occults the sun in Gemini twice in 8 years, it really has to do with increasing connectivity. And you can look at the connectivity technology in the 1870s, early 1880s. That was like literally transforming from the telegraph to the telephone. Okay, and then in 2004 to 2012, this is where social media happened. Okay, so you know, it went from like you could, you know, contact someone at a distance at any time you want, to now you can contact everyone. Like right now, perfect example of being able to you know, reach, potentially could be thousands of people, millions of people. Anyone can do that. It's not, you don't have to be a politician or someone, you know, with that Regulus and Leo structure of hierarchy to be able to do that. Anybody. That's Regulus and Virgo. It's very, you know, all the pieces matter kind of energy. So connection consciousness then increased. And like we said before, that's strong with Regulus and Virgo, is connection consciousness. This is just a couple slides I'm going to show you about the power generations, because we're just moving into this zone. I'm looking at only Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune in the chart. And there's 3 different nodes that really stand out to me. One's in the mid to late 1960s. That's when Pluto, Uranus were conjunct. Okay, we already mentioned that. And they were in a sextile to Neptune in Scorpio. And this was a certain generation that are now like late 40s to mid 50s, roughly, plus or minus. But this is like the initiation of societal transformation. And so now, you know, we have people that are in the age range of leadership at this point. So we've come a long way. And so, you know, these are just some characteristics that, you know, you can glance at, for example, of that kind of mini generation, essentially. Then we have the next node that jumps out using those same planets, Pluto, Uranus, Neptune. In this case, Uranus has moved 1 sign away from Pluto, and Neptune has moved over signs. They're all 30 degrees apart. They're all 1 sign apart. And this is my generation. This is the generation that was born essentially with Chiron and Taurus. And we are that generation, again, that was born for a world that didn't exist anymore by the time we got there. And now we're all sitting here like maybe mid 30s to mid 40s. I'm 40ish, and that's pretty much where we're at. And then these are, again, these are some of the characteristics of that. But the point is, this whole entire group from the mid 60s to the mid 90s, which we'll get to, is who's coming of age now to make the changes in the world. Here's the millennials. So now we move Uranus to catch up with Neptune, and they're now sextiling Pluto in Scorpio. So everything's kind of moved up this chart a little bit. And these folks are mostly in their 20s right now, so they're adults now, and so that's has some significance here as they come into place. And also, what's interesting for the 2020s is it is now Saturn return time for that generation. For the people born in the 90s, they're all going through their Saturn return over this next decade in the 2020s. So they're all coming of age, maturing, and we have a strong Capricorn theme of that generation. We have Uranus conjunct Neptune in Capricorn. In fact, right now, we have Pluto conjunct that Uranus-Neptune with Saturn coming up to meet there here in January, as well as Jupiter going to run by there coming up over the next year as well. So 2020 is big for this generation as far as rapid maturity. And how that plays out, what this group does is remains to be seen. But the idea being is we're moving into a more connected consciousness, connection consciousness, and technology is helping that happen. And that's going to create the paradigm shift, okay? Because we don't need leaders like we did before. We don't need representation like we did before, which is, it's just part of the evolution of liberty. Whereas before the argument was, we want representation, but, adequately and properly. That was back in the 18th century. But now it's like, do we even need representation, right? Because anyone can account for themselves and have direct impact due to modern technology. You don't necessarily need these middlemen and these leaders to represent you like we did in the past. Not that we wouldn't have some kind of structure, some kind of position or something, but perhaps we're about to move away due to technology. We will be more capable of moving away from the old systems. And like I said, as an example, maybe that means having Congress in their local districts instead of in Washington. Maybe that means, many number of things for how we govern ourselves, et cetera, to allow us more freedoms and to keep our leaders in check, essentially, so they're not spending all of our money, making more and more rules that don't apply to themselves, et cetera. And so, the globalist intention is very Regulus and Leo. It's very much like the communism and fascism aspect. It's very much about getting all the resources and people under control. Whereas, again, Virgo, with Regulus and Virgo, it's more about the individuals leading the way. And when it comes to think about it, externalities like pollution tend to come from large entities. And when you have smaller, easier to control, like, local kinds of operations, you can control pollution easier and you can have more markets for it as well. So switching to that local sovereign kind of nature is where things should be heading relative to the energies and to the individuals that are moving that through these power generations, et cetera. So how do we do it? How do we create these peaceful communities that are sustainable? Like I said, I think through that recognition of sovereign individuality, not necessarily sovereign nations, but sovereign individuality. We can, create networks, et cetera, using modern technology to do that. These guys aren't going to do it. No, that's not how we do it. And that's what we're really coming up on here. Exactly what happened in 2016 with people basically favoring candidates that were not along the traditional lines of what candidates have been before 2016. And that's going to continue. It's going to continue. People don't want the donkeys and the elephants anymore. And so what does conscious liberty look like? Like we said before, it's relative to that Regulus and Virgo transition, and it's all these factors of life shifting according to that energy. And just know that 99% of us are good-hearted people who respect others and want peace. And when you come from that perspective, that's where sovereignty makes sense in creating communities like that. It's the other 1% that want to rule the world and tell us we're at war and keep the war going. And I wouldn't put it past them, especially with the energies of 2020s. With world intentions of domination, adding some more wars in there. And maybe this is the time when we wake up and don't allow it to happen. We've got a lot of technologies out there, free scalar energy kind of technologies. Some examples here on the left: quantum power, Chowari in India, the Quiche Foundation, the Searle effect generator in San Diego. Hard to get funding for these kind of things. They've been suppressed since Tesla was suppressed. And there's a reason for it, because the same people that are, and this goes back to the Capricorn energy, the same, congregation of energy and intention for domination is all in the same pockets, essentially. And that's who owns the energy industry and who owns the narrative for climate change, which is just another way to make money off of the energy industry, essentially, because now you're double dipping, right? You can make money off the oil profits and the carbon trading profits, like enter Al Gore, a perfect example of that. Almost all of them have their hands in both pockets, and so it's just a money making thing where you create scarcity in the fossil fuel market, and then you create the dangers of fossil fuels as a story. Something that's imminent danger and whatnot. I mean, obviously there's pollution, obviously that there's always ways to improve pollution, but the idea that there's some imminent threat to the climate based on it is what we'll, I think, in my opinion, we'll come to see that as something we'll laugh at in the future, that we ever believed it. And the science will back that up, and that's where we're moving. But the idea is, like, if you got your hands in both pockets, you can really control people, because you control energy use, you control everything, and that's going to, controlling food, water, everything. And it's these technological advances that we can get these working for us, and then we can create systems that don't rely on having such power-hungry people on the top holding us down. And it's interesting to know BRICS, if you're not familiar, that's what is it? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Those are the 5 nations as part of BRICS alliance. And they're saying, anyway, this is back in 2015, they won't suppress free energy from Tawari in India. This is Indian technology. And they've got a high degree of interest in getting off the dollar, getting the world off the dollar, essentially. And here's just some more examples of technologies. And, could it be technologies like this, like maybe a group like that, an alternative financial system comes out, and that could be what kills the dollar, right? As we get to the Pluto return for the US, maybe the dollar is killed because of clinging to oil and fossil fuels. And what this will also do is erase the narrative of climate change, because if you're not emitting CO2 anymore, well, there's no climate change worry, and there's no way to be taxed on it and to be controlled by it. And so it's definitely in the best interest of those with their hands in those pockets to keep both things going, both the energy industry as it exists, as well as the narrative that it shouldn't exist anymore, because that's just a wonderful way to create division, and it works really well. Anyway, so if you think about sovereignty as, collective sovereignty as each individual candle lighting, if everything's lit, then all the shadows disappear, and that's just something to know. And so we go back to this. Is the end near? No, I don't think so, and it's certainly not going to happen this decade, and it certainly wouldn't be from CO2 emissions and what that would or wouldn't do. And here again is that article, 1989, the threat that we're going to have rising sea levels not reversed by 2000, we're in trouble, etc. Eco refugees, which we've been hearing about for decades, still hasn't happened. The Maldives, if you're not familiar with that, it's very low-lying islands in the South Pacific. They were supposed to be underwater by now. And I just saw someone post on Facebook the other day, they were at the Maldives, and the beach looks exactly the same as it did 30, 40 years ago. And there's no reason to believe it won't for a while. But anyway, so things aren't really getting worse, in my opinion. They are just getting uncovered. So we just have to hold on to each other tight and continue to pull back the veil. And that's really what we're coming down to. And I feel like the 2020s is going to be big for that. A lot of these cycles are coming to an end, which means a lot of the narratives behind them are as well. And so we have this opportunity in the 2020s to really start things brand new and start things with a fresh perspective. And by using modern technology, we really have some higher potentials than we've ever had in the past. And right now, there's threats to YouTube and other sharing of information right now. And there's efforts to create censorship, etc. That's because they're running scared. There's losing control of information. Yeah, there's some bad information out there. There's some false information out there, but we're all responsible for being intelligent enough to investigate for ourselves before making any decisions on anything. So I think it's better to have access to all the information than to have parts of it blocked, especially when those parts that are blocked are in our best interest. Anyway, so thank you for attending the Evolution of Liberty talk on the 2020s. If you do have any questions, want to raise your hand or anything, we can do that now. or if you need to leave, that's fine too. I saw some of you left already, but I'll be here for a couple minutes if you want to chat. Otherwise, I will put this up on YouTube and it will be available too to re-watch, and feel free to share it with others as well if you do get that. If you want a way for me to send that to you, just let me know here and I can do that as well.